My father-in-law looked me in the eye, smiled at everyone around the Thanksgiving table, and said, "You're just a guest here, Brielle." Why had he waited until every relative was watching to humiliate me? Why was a senior trust officer sitting quietly at the end of the table with a sealed Navy envelope? And why did my husband lower his eyes instead of saying a single word? I thought the cruelest thing that would happen that night was being reminded I'd never share the Whitmore bloodline. I was wrong, because inside that envelope was one clause written years earlier by Evelyn Whitmore, and before the night was over, it would force everyone in that room to question who truly belonged in the family. If you're listening from somewhere in the world, tell me your country and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know who's sharing this story with me today. And if stories about family truth and hard-earned justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss what happens next. The first time I met Harrison Whitmore, he shook my hand, looked directly into my eyes, and said something that sounded like a compliment. "So you're the accountant?" I smiled politely. "I'm actually a CPA. I work in internal audit." He nodded once. "Same difference." At the time, I laughed it off. Mason squeezed my hand beneath the restaurant table and whispered, "Don't take it personally. Dad's never been good with titles." I wanted to believe him. Looking back now, I realize Harrison had already decided exactly where I belonged before he learned anything about me. Not as Brielle Powell, not as a woman with her own career, certainly not as someone who might one day become part of his family, just the accountant. 3 years before that Thanksgiving dinner, my life looked nothing like the one I have now. I had spent nearly a decade building a career in New York, eventually becoming director of internal audit for one of the largest healthcare systems in the Northeast. Most people hear internal audit and imagine someone who checks receipts. The reality is much broader. My job was to examine financial systems, identify weaknesses before they became disasters, investigate regular transactions, and make sure organizations followed both the law and their own policies. Every recommendation had to be supported by documentation. Every conclusion needed evidence. Feelings didn't survive very long in my profession. Facts did. That mindset had served me well professionally. I just hadn't realized how badly I would need it inside my own marriage. I met Mason Whitmore during a corporate governance conference in Boston. He wasn't giving the keynote speech. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. Instead, he sat beside me during a panel discussion, quietly taking notes while everyone else checked their phones. When the moderator asked a question about ethical leadership, Mason leaned over and whispered, "Amazing how everyone agrees integrity matters until it costs money." I laughed. That single sentence started a conversation that lasted through lunch, then dinner, then months of phone calls. He was intelligent without showing off, confident without being arrogant, kind in ways that felt genuine. He told me his family owned Whitmore Capital, a private investment firm headquartered in Connecticut, but he rarely talked about money. Instead, he asked about my work, my parents, the community programs I volunteered for, and why I always carried a notebook instead of relying on my phone. "No app remembers details the way handwriting does," I told him. He smiled. "I think my grandmother would like you." Months later, I finally met Evelyn Whitmore. She was already in her late 80s, sharp-eyed despite moving slowly with a cane. Instead of asking about my salary or my background, she asked a different question. "What do you do when nobody is watching?" I wasn't expecting that. "I hope I make the same decisions I would if everyone were watching." She smiled. "That's harder than people think." Over the next year, she invited me to tea several times whenever Mason and I visited Connecticut. She loved asking questions. Not the kind people ask to fill silence. Questions that made you think. What kind of mistake is hardest to admit? When does helping someone become enabling? What does loyalty cost? Sometimes we talked about books, sometimes about business, sometimes about nothing at all. She never once made me feel like an outsider. Everyone else did enough of that already. After Mason and I married, we bought a townhouse in Westchester County instead of moving into one of the Whitmore family properties. That decision disappointed Harrison immediately. "Families stay close," he said. "We're only an hour away," Mason replied. "That's not what I meant." I understood exactly what he meant. Living independently meant fewer opportunities for him to supervise our lives. Still, I convinced myself things would improve. Margaret always remained pleasant. Claire was professional, though distant. Only Harrison seemed determined to remind me that I wasn't really one of them. He never yelled. He rarely insulted me directly. His methods were subtler. Whenever reporters attended charity events, he introduced me proudly. "This is my daughter-in-law, Brielle. She's brilliant with financial controls." The moment cameras disappeared, I became invisible again. During family strategy dinners, Harrison invited everyone into his study afterward. Everyone except me. "Mason, Claire, Margaret, come inside." Then he'd glance toward me. "Brielle, could you help the staff clear the table?" The first few times I assumed it was coincidence. By the 6th or 7th time, coincidence no longer seemed likely. One evening after everyone had left the study, Harrison walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of folders. "Brielle," he said casually, "would you mind looking over these donation records sometime this week?" I opened the folder. It contained financial reports for one of the Whitmore charitable foundations. Several entries had been categorized incorrectly, creating unnecessary tax exposure. It took me nearly 6 hours to correct everything. When I emailed my recommendations, Harrison replied with exactly 6 words. "Received. Will implement the necessary corrections." No thank you, no acknowledgement, nothing. I didn't expect praise, but I did notice the pattern. Months later, another foundation faced an IRS compliance review. Again, Harrison asked if I could I take a quick look. A quick look became an entire weekend. I reorganized documentation, identified missing receipts, corrected reporting inconsistencies, and created an audit trail that satisfied every question before regulators ever asked it. The review ended without penalties. At Sunday dinner, Harrison raised a glass. "I'm pleased the foundation avoided unnecessary complications." Everyone smiled. No one mentioned why. On the drive home, I stared out the passenger window. "You could have at least told them I helped," I said quietly. Mason kept his eyes on the road. Dad probably assumed everyone knew. "They didn't." "I know. Doesn't that bother you?" He sighed. "You know how he is." There it was. The sentence I would hear over and over again. "You know how he is," as though understanding someone's behavior somehow erased its impact, as though familiarity excused disrespect. I wanted my husband to say something much simpler. "You're right. He shouldn't have done that." Instead, every conversation ended with another explanation, another excuse, another request to let it go. I kept letting it go, not because Harrison deserved it, because I believed protecting my marriage mattered more than winning small arguments. What I didn't realize was that every unchallenged moment was teaching Harrison something dangerous, that there would be no consequences. That silence meant permission, that if he pushed just a little further each time, no one, including his own son, would stop him. About 6 months before Thanksgiving, I noticed something else that didn't fit. Whenever Harrison hosted what he called family planning meetings, the invitations always went to the same people: Harrison, Margaret, Mason, Claire, occasionally the company's outside attorney. Never me. Oddly enough, a day or 2 after those meetings, Mason would call. "Brielle, Dad was wondering if you could review a few financial documents." Sometimes it was trust distribution summaries, sometimes nonprofit compliance paperwork, sometimes governance reports. I wasn't included in the discussions that produced the documents. But somehow I was always trusted to fix whatever problems they contained. One evening after finishing another review, I handed the folder back to Harrison. I noticed several policy revisions referenced meeting minutes that aren't attached. They're confidential. I only asked because the financial recommendations refer to those discussions. We've already handled that part. His tone wasn't rude, it was final. I nodded, but something lingered in my mind. In auditing, missing context is rarely accidental. People don't separate documents without a reason, especially when those documents explain why decisions were made. A few days later, while helping Margaret organize boxes for Thanksgiving preparations, she picked up an old photograph of Evelyn Whitmore and smiled sadly. She always worried this family would confuse inheritance with character. I looked up. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, as though she'd said more than she intended. "Oh, it's nothing." You sounded like she had strong opinions. Margaret gave a faint laugh. Evelyn believed money should reward responsibility, not simply blood. She placed the photograph back into the box, and she insisted on adding some unusual provisions to the family trust. "What kind of provisions?" Margaret froze for half a second. "I honestly don't remember the details." Before I could ask another question, Harrison walked into the room. "Margaret." His voice was calm. "Dinner's ready." She immediately changed the subject. On the drive home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd almost told me. Evelyn Whitmore had trusted me from the beginning. Harrison had spent years reminding me I would never belong. Somewhere between those two truths, there had to be a story no one wanted me to hear. 3 days later, while checking the seating chart Margaret had texted to everyone for Thanksgiving dinner, one unfamiliar name caught my attention. Benjamin Carter, Senior Trust Officer, not a cousin, not a family friend, not a business partner, just a man from the bank. I stared at his name for several seconds before locking my phone. Why would a trust officer be attending Thanksgiving dinner? I tried convincing myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe Benjamin Carter was an old family friend who happened to work in wealth management. Maybe Harrison had invited him because they were discussing charitable donations after dinner. Families with significant assets often had attorneys, accountants, and trust officers they knew personally. It wasn't unusual. What was unusual was putting his name on the Thanksgiving seating chart. That wasn't a business meeting. That was family. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my phone buzzed while I was reviewing a quarterly compliance report at work. It was Mason. "Dad wants to move dinner from 6 to 5. "Why? He didn't say." "Is Benjamin Carter coming because of the trust?" There was a pause. "I don't know." "You don't know. Or you don't want to tell me." "Brielle." His voice became careful. "I honestly don't know." I believed him. That was the frustrating part. Mason wasn't a liar. He simply accepted not being told things. His father had spent decades making major decisions without explanation, and somewhere along the way, Mason had learned that asking questions only created conflict. I had learned the opposite. If someone resisted reasonable questions, there was usually a reason. That afternoon, I finished work later than expected. As I walked toward the parking garage, my colleague and closest friend, Denise Harper, caught up with me carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been staring at the same spreadsheet for 20 minutes. "I wasn't looking at the spreadsheet." She handed me one of the cups. "Family." I smiled. "You know me too well." Denise had worked in forensic accounting for almost 15 years before joining our audit department. She had an uncanny ability to notice what other people ignored. After listening quietly while I explained the Thanksgiving invitation and Benjamin Carter's appearance on the guest list, she frowned. A trust officer doesn't usually spend Thanksgiving with clients. My thought exactly. Unless... She stopped. Unless what? Unless the trust requires something to happen on a specific date. I looked at her. Like what? A required reading. A beneficiary meeting. A trustee certification? An amendment becoming effective? She shrugged. Or something completely different. I leaned back in my chair. Could Harrison be changing the trust? Maybe. But if the person who created the trust is deceased, changes usually aren't that simple. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. If I were you, I'd pay attention to what nobody expects you to notice. That sentence stayed with me all evening. Pay attention, not react, observe. Exactly what I did for a living. The following morning, I drove to Connecticut earlier than planned. Margaret had asked whether I could help prepare desserts before everyone else arrived the next day. When I entered the Whitmore estate, the house already felt unusually busy. Delivery trucks came and went, florists arranged centerpieces, staff moved antique dining chairs into the formal dining room. Everything looked immaculate. Everything also looked tense. Harrison crossed the foyer carrying several leather folders. He stopped when he saw me. Oh, you're early. I thought I'd help Margaret. He nodded. She's in the kitchen. As he walked away, one folder slipped slightly under his arm. Not enough for me to read everything. Just enough to catch a single line printed across the top. Annual Trustee Compliance Review. The title lasted less than a second before he adjusted the folder. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Years of auditing had trained my eyes differently. Documents tell stories long before you open them. I didn't chase after him. I didn't ask questions. I simply memorized the wording. Later that afternoon, while arranging silverware with Margaret, I asked as casually as I could, busy week. She laughed softly. You have no idea. Board meeting? Something like that. What does Annual Trustee Compliance Review mean? The serving spoon nearly slipped from her hand. She recovered quickly. I don't really know. You've never heard of it. I've heard the phrase. But Harrison handles all that. She immediately changed the subject. Would you slice the pecan pie? Another answer without an answer. Another conversation that ended too quickly. By evening, the house had filled with relatives arriving from Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington. Cousins, uncles, children running through hallways. Laughter echoed from every room. For a while, I almost forgot my suspicions. Until Claire joined me on the back patio. She wrapped her coat tighter against the cold. Nice night. It is. She looked toward the garden before speaking again. Dad's been under a lot of pressure lately. I've noticed he just wants everything organized. For what? She smiled politely. For the future. There it was again. The future. Everyone used that word. No one explained it. What future? Claire shrugged. You'll understand eventually. I would understand now if someone simply explained it. She looked at me for several seconds. Then she gave a smile that never reached her eyes. Some conversations stay inside the family. The words landed harder than she probably intended. Inside the family, not including me. Before I could respond, she excused herself to answer a phone call. I stood alone on the patio watching snow begin to fall across the gardens. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger clouds judgment. I was curious. Curiosity was much more useful. The next morning, Thanksgiving Day, I woke before sunrise and went for a walk through the neighborhood. The cold air helped me think. If Harrison truly intended to exclude me from whatever was happening, then reacting emotionally would only confirm every assumption he had about me. He expected sensitivity. He expected confrontation. He expected me to prove I didn't belong. I decided to do the opposite. Observe, listen, remember. When I returned to the house, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown callers. Something told me not to this time. Hello? Mrs. Whitmore. The voice was calm and professional. This is Benjamin Carter. I stopped walking. The trust off. Yes. I hope I'm not interrupting. No. There was a brief silence. I wanted to confirm that you'll be attending dinner this evening. I frowned. Yes, of course. Excellent. His tone remained measured. It is important that you're present. I waited. He didn't continue. May I ask why? I'm afraid I can't discuss trust matters before the scheduled meeting. So this is about the trust. I'm only calling to confirm attendance. Mr. Carter? Another brief pause. Then he said something that made my pulse quicken. Mrs. Whitmore, there are occasions when the presence of a particular individual is legally significant. What does that mean? I'm sorry. I can't explain further. Everything that needs to be said will be said this evening. The line went quiet. Then he added one final sentence. I appreciate that you answered the phone. Before I could ask another question, the call ended. I stared at the screen. No voicemail, no follow-up message, nothing. Just a completed call from a trust officer who had gone out of his way to make sure I would be sitting at the Thanksgiving table. When I walked back into the house, Harrison was already greeting arriving guests with effortless charm. He laughed, shook hands, patted shoulders. No one looking at him would have guessed he had spent the past week carefully controlling information from nearly everyone around him. Across the foyer, I noticed Benjamin Carter entering through the front door. He wasn't carrying luggage. He wasn't dressed like a holiday guest. He carried a slim black leather briefcase, and in his left hand was the same navy blue sealed envelope I had seen listed on the seating arrangements. This time I noticed something else. A small white label had been placed across the seal. One line was visible before Benjamin slipped the envelope into his briefcase. It read, "To be opened only after all required parties are present." By 5 o'clock, every chair around the Whitmore dining table was filled. Thanksgiving had always been Harrison's favorite holiday, not because he loved turkey, not because he enjoyed family traditions. He loved it because everyone came to him. His house, his schedule, his rules. The dining room looked exactly as I remembered from previous years. A 30-foot walnut table polished until it reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead. White roses mixed with eucalyptus ran down the center. Every place setting had a handwritten name card. The seating arrangement was never random. Harrison believed where a person sat reflected where they stood in the family. Mason and I arrived together, but our name cards weren't beside each other. He had been placed halfway down one side of the table with the other senior members of the family. My card rested near the far end beside two distant cousins I had only met once before. Benjamin Carter's seat was directly across from Harrison. No one questioned it, at least not out loud. I quietly pulled out my chair. One of the cousins beside me leaned over and whispered apologetically, "I thought spouses usually sat together." "So did I," I replied with a small smile. Across the room, I caught Mason looking toward me. For a brief second, our eyes met. He noticed the seating arrangement. I could tell. He hesitated, as if considering saying something. Then Harrison began speaking. The moment passed. Dinner started with the usual traditions. A short prayer, passing the turkey, compliments about Margaret's stuffing, children laughing over cranberry sauce. For almost 20 minutes, it felt like an ordinary family gathering. Benjamin barely touched his food. Instead, he occasionally glanced at the leather briefcase resting beside his chair. He wasn't nervous. He was waiting. I noticed because waiting was something auditors recognized instinctively. People waiting for the right moment rarely wasted energy on small talk. Harrison, meanwhile, seemed unusually cheerful. He told stories from Mason's childhood. He joked with cousins. He toasted successful business deals from the past year. Then, after dessert plates had been cleared, he stood with a glass of wine in his hand. The room gradually became quiet. "I've always believed Thanksgiving is about gratitude," he began. Several relatives nodded. "It's also about remembering who we are." Another pause. "Our family has survived because every generation understood the importance of protecting the Whitmore name." He looked around the room. "The businesses, the foundations, the traditions, they exist because blood carries responsibility." The sentence felt oddly deliberate, as though he were laying a foundation. His gaze eventually reached me. For just a heartbeat, he smiled. Then he said it. "Some people are born into this family." His eyes remained on mine. "Others are fortunate enough to visit." A few uncomfortable chuckles drifted across the table. Nobody knew where he was going. Neither did I, until he continued. "I've always welcomed those who marry into the family." Another pause. "But let's be honest." He lifted his glass slightly toward me. "Brielle is a wonderful woman. I respect her career. I appreciate what she's done. But at the end of the day," he smiled again, "she's just a guest." Silence. Complete silence. I heard someone quietly set down a fork. Across the table, Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. Claire stared at her plate. No one laughed this time. My heartbeat remained surprisingly steady. If Harrison expected tears, he wasn't getting them. I looked directly back at him. "Thank you for clarifying how you see me." My voice was calm. There wasn't a trace of anger in it. That seemed to surprise him more than if I had shouted. He tilted his head slightly. "I simply believe honesty prevents confusion." "I agree." I nodded once. "Honesty is important." For the first time all evening, Harrison looked uncertain. Not because of what I had said, because I hadn't reacted the way he expected. He was used to controlling conversations through emotion. I had given him none. Beside me, one of the cousins whispered, "I'm so sorry." I smiled politely. "It's all right." No, it wasn't all right, but there would be time to process that later. At the opposite end of the table, Mason finally spoke. "Dad." His voice was hesitant. "I don't think that was necessary." Harrison looked at his son. It was truthful. "There are kinder ways to say the truth." "The truth doesn't become false simply because it makes people uncomfortable." Mason opened his mouth again, then closed it. He looked toward me. "I'm sorry." 2 words. Quiet, sincere, and painfully late. Benjamin Carter folded his napkin with careful precision and placed it beside his plate. He stood. The room instinctively turned toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen." His tone was formal but courteous. "I apologize for interrupting your holiday." Harrison immediately raised one hand. "Benjamin, whatever this is can wait until Monday." Benjamin didn't sit down. "I'm afraid it cannot." Harrison's smile stiffened. "This is a family dinner," Benjamin answered calmly. "Precisely." A strange tension settled across the room. No one reached for dessert. No one spoke. Benjamin rested one hand on his briefcase. "I was instructed to appear here today by the Whitmore Family Trust." Harrison's jaw tightened. "That instruction is unnecessary." "With respect, Mr. Whitmore." Benjamin's voice never changed. "It is mandatory." The word mandatory echoed through the dining room. Harrison took a slow breath. "I serve as co-trustee." "I'm aware." "Then you know this discussion can happen privately." Benjamin gave a slight shake of his head. The governing documents state otherwise. For the first time in the 20 minutes since Harrison had humiliated me, I saw something unexpected. Not anger, not confidence, concern, real concern. Margaret looked from Harrison to Benjamin. Harrison, did you know about this? He didn't answer immediately. I assumed it had already been addressed. Benjamin spoke before anyone else could. It has not. He reached into the briefcase and removed the navy blue envelope. Every eye followed it. The seal remained intact. Across the front was embossed silver lettering, Whitmore Family Trust, established 1987. Beneath it sat the same white label I had noticed earlier. Benjamin held the envelope where everyone could see it. The instructions attached to this document are explicit. He adjusted his glasses before continuing. It may only be opened once all required parties are physically present. He slowly looked around the table. Harrison Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore, Mason Whitmore, Claire Whitmore. Then, his eyes settled on me, and Brielle Powell Whitmore. A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. Harrison interrupted immediately. She's only here because she's Mason's wife. Benjamin met his eyes. No, sir. His answer came without hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore is listed by name. The room became even quieter. Benjamin carefully broke the seal. He unfolded a thick cream-colored document yellowed slightly with age. I have been instructed to read Clause 12 exactly as Evelyn Whitmore wrote it. He looked down at the first page. Then, before reading a single word, he lifted his head one last time. I would respectfully ask that no one interrupt until the clause has been read in full. Harrison leaned forward in his chair. You don't understand what you're doing. Benjamin's expression remained composed. I understand my duty. He lowered his eyes to the document. The first sentence left his lips. For the purpose of this trust. He paused only long enough to ensure every person in the room was listening. The word family shall not be determined by blood alone. No one moved. No one reached for a glass. Even the children at the smaller table in the adjoining breakfast room had stopped talking, sensing something unusual was happening without understanding what it was. Benjamin Carter continued reading in the same measured tone. For the purpose of this trust, the word family shall not be determined by blood alone. Character, stewardship, and demonstrated commitment to the well-being of this family shall carry equal weight with lineage. The words seemed to settle over the room one by one. Harrison let out a quiet scoff. Evelyn always enjoyed dramatic language. Benjamin didn't look up. No descendant of mine shall presume entitlement based solely upon birth. Claire shifted in her chair. Margaret slowly lowered her eyes. I looked toward Mason. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the document in Benjamin's hands as though he were hearing about his grandmother for the first time. Benjamin continued. Every appointed trustee shall ensure that conduct is evaluated alongside inheritance. Those who protect this family's integrity deserve recognition equal to those born into it. Another silence. This one lasted longer. Finally, Harrison placed both palms flat on the table. That's enough. Benjamin calmly looked up. I'm only halfway through the clause. I've heard enough. I'm afraid the instructions require the complete reading. I am co-trustee, and I serve as trust officer. Benjamin's voice never rose. My responsibility is to administer the trust exactly as written. Harrison's expression hardened. This isn't the place. Benjamin answered almost immediately. This is the exact place Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore specified. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. One of Harrison's older cousins frowned. She specified Thanksgiving. Benjamin nodded. Yes. He reached into the envelope again and removed a second document. "This is an administrative instruction attached to Clause 12. He read directly from it. "This clause shall be read aloud during the first Thanksgiving gathering held after my passing, at which all required parties are present." Margaret's hand covered her mouth. "I never knew." Benjamin looked toward her kindly. "Very few people did." Harrison folded his arms. "Why would my mother keep something like this secret?" Benjamin answered carefully. "Because she believed revealing it early would encourage people to behave for appearances rather than from conviction." No one responded. I found myself thinking back to every conversation I'd had with Evelyn. What do you do when nobody is watching? What does loyalty cost? At the time, I had assumed those were simply philosophical questions. Now I wasn't so sure. Benjamin continued. "The clause itself establishes a governing principle." He lifted another page. "The supporting appendix explains how that principle was to be evaluated." Harrison immediately interrupted. "There is no appendix." "There is. I've reviewed every trust amendment." Benjamin gave a slight shake of his head. "This was never an amendment." He held up the cream-colored packet. "It was incorporated into the original governing documents before the trust became irrevocable." Claire leaned forward. "So, you're saying Grandma planned this from the beginning?" "Yes." "When?" "Nearly 4 decades ago." That answer seemed to affect Harrison more than anyone else. He blinked several times before speaking. "Impossible." Benjamin looked directly at him. "Mr. Whitmore, your mother revised her estate plan several times during her lifetime. None of those revisions removed this appendix. You received copies of the primary trust documents after her passing. The confidential evaluation procedures remained with the institutional trustee exactly as she instructed." The room became eerily quiet again. For the first time all evening, Harrison looked like a man who had lost control of a conversation. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was calculating, trying to understand what information everyone else now possessed that he didn't. Benjamin carefully placed the first document on the table and opened the second. Across the top, I could clearly read the title, Appendix C, Stewardship Evaluation Procedures. I frowned. Stewardship. That wasn't a legal term people usually associated with inheritance. Benjamin anticipated the confusion. Mrs. Whitmore believed wealth should be managed rather than merely owned. He looked around the table. Her trust therefore required periodic evaluations of stewardship. One of the cousins raised a hand almost instinctively. "You mean someone has been grading us?" A faint smile crossed Benjamin's face. "Not grading. Observing." The distinction mattered. As an auditor, I understood it immediately. An observation wasn't an opinion. It was a documented record supported by evidence. Benjamin continued. Mrs. Whitmore specifically prohibited personality rankings. There are no scores for charm, no scores for popularity, no scores for social standing, only documented actions. Harrison laughed once, a short, dismissive sound. "So someone has been spying on my family," Benjamin answered without hesitation. "No." "Your mother anticipated that concern." He lifted another page. "The evaluations may rely only upon independently verifiable records." He began listing examples. Financial documents, foundation records, trustee meeting minutes, charitable reports, written correspondence voluntarily provided, professional invoices, court filings, public records, no private surveillance, no secret recordings, no speculation. Everything Benjamin described sounded remarkably familiar. It sounded exactly like the evidentiary standards I used every day in internal investigations. Harrison seemed to notice the same connection. He looked toward me briefly, then back to Benjamin. So who performed these evaluations? The institutional trustee, using independent professionals when appropriate, such as certified public accountants, governance consultants, estate attorneys, compliance specialists. Benjamin paused. Individuals with no financial interest in the outcome. Claire folded her arms. And what exactly were they evaluating? Benjamin turned another page. The willingness to protect family assets. The integrity shown when no reward was expected. The treatment of vulnerable family members. The responsible handling of charitable obligations. The ability to place long-term family interests above personal gain. No one spoke. I remembered Evelyn asking me years ago, what does responsibility look like when nobody notices? Back then, I hadn't understood why she smiled after I answered. Now pieces were beginning to fit together. Margaret broke the silence. Harrison, did Evelyn ever ask you those kinds of questions? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, she asked everyone strange questions. Benjamin nodded gently. Yes, she did. Because she believed answers spoken in a living room mattered far less than decisions reflected in documents years later. Again, evidence, not promises, not speeches, evidence. Benjamin closed the appendix for a moment. There is one more point everyone should understand before we continue. His tone became even more formal. The evaluation process has been conducted every year. Several people gasped quietly. Every year, Claire repeated. Since Mrs. Whitmore's passing. And every annual review has been preserved as part of the Trust's permanent administrative record. Harrison leaned forward. I've never seen these records. No. You weren't supposed to. Why not? Because your mother believed that if beneficiaries knew exactly when they were being evaluated, Benjamin glanced around the table, they would perform kindness instead of practicing it. The sentence struck something deep inside me. No one around that table could argue with its logic. Acts done for applause weren't the same as acts done because they were right. Benjamin rested one hand on the stack of documents. I have summarized the evaluation process. I will now begin discussing the findings relevant to Clause 12. Harrison immediately spoke. I object. Benjamin looked at him. You may object. But the governing instrument requires that I continue. He reached back into his briefcase one final time. Instead of another legal document, he removed several thick file folders. Each folder carried a printed label. Whitmore Family Stewardship Review. Confidential, one folder, then another, then another. Finally, he placed a fourth folder gently on the table. Unlike the others, this one had a white tab across the top. Typed neatly on the label were 3 words, Brielle Powell Whitmore. For a long moment, no one said a word. My name sat on that folder as if it belonged there. I wasn't sure what unsettled Harrison more, that Benjamin had a file on me, or that it had been placed on the table beside the files bearing the Whitmore name. Harrison looked at the label and let out a dry laugh. So, my daughter-in-law has her own report. Benjamin met his eyes. So does everyone else who was designated as a required party under the trust. I'd like to see mine. You will. But Mrs. Whitmore instructed that the findings be presented in a specific order. He rested one hand on my folder. And Mrs. Brielle Powell Whitmore's report is first. I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't expected it. In fact, I wanted the opposite. I wanted Thanksgiving dinner to end quietly so Mason and I could drive home and decide what boundaries we needed with his family. Instead, I was sitting at the center of something Evelyn Whitmore had apparently planned years before her death. Benjamin opened the folder carefully. The documents inside were organized with color-coded tabs. Each section contained supporting records clipped neatly behind a summary page. My professional instincts surfaced immediately. Whoever assembled these files understood documentation. Nothing appeared random. Nothing relied on opinion. Benjamin looked around the room before speaking. Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore left written instructions that every observation presented tonight must be supported by independently verifiable evidence. He lifted the first page. I will therefore summarize each finding before identifying the supporting documentation. Harrison folded his arms. Let's get this over with. Benjamin ignored the remark. Finding 1. He read slowly. Mrs. Brielle Powell Whitmore repeatedly acted to protect family interests, despite having neither legal obligation nor financial incentive to do so. A quiet murmur moved around the table. Benjamin continued. The supporting documentation begins in March of 3 years ago. He picked up a second sheet. The Whitmore Children's Scholarship Foundation prepared to issue approximately $600,000 in annual scholarships. Claire looked confused. What does that have to do with Brielle? Benjamin answered without looking away from the report. The foundation's financial records contained several classification errors that would likely have delayed distribution. I immediately remembered the project. Margaret had called me one Saturday morning. Brielle Harrison says you're good with nonprofit compliance. I'll take a look. At the time, I assumed it would require an hour. Instead, I spent most of the weekend reviewing grant documentation, donor restrictions, and reporting schedules. Several scholarship payments had accidentally been coded against restricted funds. Nothing illegal, but enough to trigger serious questions during an audit. Benjamin continued reading. Mrs. Powell Whitmore identified the reporting errors, prepared corrective schedules, and documented compliance procedures before the annual review. He lifted another page. The foundation subsequently passed its external audit without findings. He paused. There is no invoice requesting payment. One of Harrison's cousins looked toward me. You weren't paid. I shook my head. No. Benjamin added quietly, Mrs. Powell Whitmore declined compensation. I had forgotten that part. Harrison had offered to reimburse my travel expenses after I finished. I told him it wasn't necessary. We were family. Or at least, I thought we were becoming one. Benjamin turned to the next section. Finding 2. Mrs. Powell Whitmore prevented material tax exposure involving the Whitmore Family Charitable Fund. Harrison interrupted. That wasn't a major issue. Benjamin calmly reached for another document. The Internal Revenue Correspondence. Estimated potential penalties and interest between $243,000 and $287,000. Several people at the table looked sharply toward Harrison. Margaret blinked. I thought the accountants handled that. Benjamin looked at her kindly. They did. He glanced at me. Mrs. Powell Whitmore identified the issue before the filing deadline. Again, memories returned. Boxes of receipts. Incorrect donor acknowledgments. A reporting deadline only days away. I had worked until nearly midnight for 2 consecutive evenings because Harrison insisted the foundation couldn't afford delays. When I emailed the completed package, his entire reply had been received. We'll submit tomorrow. That was all. No acknowledgement, no thanks, nothing. Benjamin reached behind the summary page and held up printed emails. The contemporaneous correspondence confirms Mrs. Powell Whitmore completed the review voluntarily. He placed the documents back into the folder. The foundation avoided penalties. Claire stared at her father. You never told us? Harrison's jaw tightened. There was nothing worth discussing. Benjamin did not comment. He simply continued. Finding 3. This time his tone softened. Mrs. Powell Whitmore consistently provided personal assistance to Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore, during periods of declining health without requesting recognition or reimbursement. I looked down instinctively. I hadn't thought about those afternoons in a long time. Evelyn hated being treated like someone fragile. Whenever I visited, she refused to let anyone fuss over her. She preferred tea in the library instead of the sitting room because the library overlooked the gardens. Some days we discussed books. Other days she asked me about fraud investigations, corporate ethics, or strange financial schemes she'd read about in newspapers. Once she laughed for nearly 5 minutes after hearing about someone who had attempted to hide millions of dollars through fake consulting contracts. "People underestimate paper trails," she'd said. "They underestimate people willing to follow them," I replied. She smiled proudly. "Exactly." Benjamin continued reading. The record reflects 27 documented visits during Mrs. Whitmore's final 18 months. Margaret looked surprised. 27. "I thought Brielle came only when Mason visited," I quietly answered. "Sometimes I came alone." No one knew. Not because I hid it, because I never thought it mattered. If Mason had business travel, I'd occasionally drive to Connecticut on a Saturday just to spend the afternoon with Evelyn. She enjoyed company. I enjoyed listening. Benjamin held up another document. "This is a handwritten note recovered from Mrs. Whitmore's personal files." He looked at me briefly. "I have been authorized to read it." He unfolded the page carefully. "Brielle never arrives empty-handed." A faint smile appeared on Margaret's face. Benjamin continued. "Sometimes she brings soup. Sometimes books. Sometimes absolutely nothing except her full attention. She has never once asked me about money. She asks about people." My throat tightened. I hadn't known Evelyn kept notes like that. Benjamin kept reading. "When I speak, she listens. When I am tired, she notices before I say anything. When I refuse help, she respects my dignity instead of insisting." The room was completely silent. Even Harrison wasn't interrupting anymore. Benjamin folded the letter carefully. Mrs. Whitmore concluded that entry with one final sentence. He looked toward the table before reading. "Some people inherit a family. Others choose to care for one. The second requires more character." I heard someone quietly sniffle. Margaret wiped at the corner of one eye. Claire stared at the tabletop. Across from me, Mason slowly reached for my hand beneath the table. For the first time that evening, I didn't pull away. Benjamin closed the handwritten letter and placed it back inside the folder. "I have one final finding to summarize." His voice returned to its professional tone. "Mrs. Powell Whitmore repeatedly demonstrated stewardship consistent with the principles described in Clause 12. He paused. "The supporting evidence includes Correspondence Foundation records, trustee memoranda, charitable governance reports, and Mrs. Whitmore's personal observations." Harrison finally spoke. "So my mother liked her." Benjamin answered calmly. "This report is not about affection. It's about documented conduct. There is an important legal difference." Harrison looked away. Benjamin continued. "The findings themselves do not transfer property. They do not change beneficiary percentages. They do not rewrite the trust." Claire let out a small breath. "So what do they change?" Benjamin closed Brielle's folder with deliberate care. "They determine who satisfies Mrs. Whitmore's definition of family stewardship under Clause 12. He rested both hands on the stack of documents. "And that determination activates a separate section of the trust." My pulse quickened again. Separate section. I glanced toward Mason. He looked just as confused as I was. Benjamin reached into the envelope one final time. There was still another sealed document inside. Unlike the previous papers, this one bore a crimson ribbon across the front. The cover page contained only a short title, Implementation of Clause 12. effective upon formal determination. Benjamin carefully untied the ribbon. Then he looked directly at Harrison. "Mr. Whitmore, what I'm about to read explains exactly how your mother's definition of family affects the governance of this trust." Benjamin untied the crimson ribbon with deliberate care. No one at the table spoke. The soft rustle of paper seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Harrison finally leaned back in his chair. "I've listened patiently long enough." Benjamin acknowledged him with a slight nod. "I appreciate that. But the administrative instructions require this section to be read immediately after the stewardship findings." Harrison let out a slow breath through his nose. "I've managed this trust for nearly 15 years. I'm aware. I've never seen that document. You were never supposed to." That answer landed harder than anything Benjamin had said all evening. Harrison stared at him. What exactly does that mean? Benjamin looked around the table before answering. "It means Mrs. Evelyn Whitmore intentionally separated governance instructions from operational documents." Claire frowned. "Why would Grandma do that?" Benjamin closed the folder in front of him for a moment. "Because she believed that concentrated power eventually tempts even decent people." No one interrupted. He continued. "She wrote that no individual, including her own descendants, should ever possess enough authority to quietly redefine her intentions." I noticed Harrison's fingers tightening around the stem of his wine glass. He wasn't angry because someone had disagreed with him. He was angry because his mother had anticipated him. Benjamin opened the crimson-bound document. "The title of this section is straightforward," he read aloud. "Implementation of Clause 12. Then he turned the page. "If, during any annual stewardship review, the institutional trustee determines that a required family participant has consistently demonstrated stewardship as defined herein," he paused briefly, "that participant shall become a family steward for purposes of trust governance." Several relatives exchanged puzzled looks. One of Mason's uncles spoke first. "What exactly is a family steward?" Benjamin answered without hesitation. "A governance role." "Not ownership." "Not an inheritance." "A responsibility." Claire tilted her head. "So, another trustee." "Not exactly." Benjamin smiled politely. "The distinction matters." He looked toward the entire table. "A trustee manages assets. A family steward oversees accountability." He continued explaining in plain language. "The trust owns the assets. The trustees administer those assets. The family stewards supervise certain major decisions made by the trustees." I immediately understood the structure. Corporate governance, checks and balances. Exactly the kind of oversight many organizations use to prevent abuse of authority, Benjamin continued. Mrs. Whitmore believed wealth survives generations only when authority is reviewed, not assumed. Harrison finally interrupted again. "I have always acted in the family's best interests." Benjamin met his eyes calmly. "This document doesn't accuse you otherwise. It simply limits unilateral authority." That single sentence changed the atmosphere in the room. Until then, everyone had assumed Harrison controlled the Whitmore Trust. Apparently, he didn't. At least not entirely. Benjamin turned another page. The trust identifies 5 categories of decisions requiring steward concurrence. He began listing them slowly. Sale of major family assets. Removal or appointment of trustees. Changes affecting charitable foundations. Liquidation of legacy properties. Extraordinary distributions exceeding established thresholds. Claire blinked. "Dad has always approved those." Benjamin nodded. "He has. Because no family steward had yet been formally recognized." The room fell quiet again. Harrison spoke carefully this time. You're saying my authority changes because someone has now been recognized? Yes. And who exactly has been recognized? Benjamin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at Brielle's folder. The annual review determined that Mrs. Brielle Powell Whitmore satisfies the stewardship requirements established under Clause 12. My stomach tightened. I wasn't expecting my name again. Benjamin continued. Accordingly, he looked down at the document. Effective upon formal reading of these findings, Mrs. Brielle Powell Whitmore is recognized as the first family steward under the Whitmore Family Trust. No one breathed. Even I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. Claire was the first to react. What? One of the older cousins whispered. Did he say Brielle? Margaret stared at Benjamin in disbelief. Harrison. Did you know this was possible? He didn't answer. His face had gone almost completely expressionless. That worried me more than anger would have. Benjamin continued speaking before anyone else could. I want to clarify something. He looked directly at me. Mrs. Whitmore, this appointment does not grant you ownership of trust assets. It does not transfer wealth. It does not reduce anyone else's inheritance. I nodded slowly. I understand. It grants only one thing. He held up the governing document. The legal authority to require review before certain major trust decisions become effective. I recognized exactly what that meant. Not control, oversight, the ability to ask questions, the ability to require documentation, the ability to prevent someone from acting alone. In other words, exactly what I had done professionally for most of my career. Benjamin continued. For clarity, he reached for another sheet. The trust specifically states that the family steward role should, whenever possible, be filled by someone with demonstrated financial integrity, independence of judgment, and documented willingness to protect family interests without expectation of personal gain. My eyes widened slightly. That wasn't an emotional description. It sounded almost like a hiring profile. Evelyn hadn't been choosing her favorite person. She had been defining qualifications. Benjamin closed the document. Mrs. Whitmore believed stewardship should be earned, not inherited. Across the table, Harrison finally spoke again. So, my own mother bypassed her own children. Benjamin answered carefully. No. She established standards. Mrs. Brielle Powell Whitmore met those standards. Another silence. This one felt heavier than before. Mason slowly turned toward his father. Dad, you've always told me Grandma believed responsibility mattered. Harrison didn't respond. You never told me she actually wrote that into the trust. Still nothing. Claire spoke next. Is this why you kept saying Grandma's estate planning was complicated? Harrison looked at his daughter. I handled exactly what I was given. Benjamin quietly corrected him. You handled the portions assigned to the co-trustees. The institutional trustee retained the governance review procedures. It was such a small clarification, but it shifted everything. Harrison hadn't been lying. He simply hadn't known the whole structure, which meant Evelyn had never intended for any one person, not even her own son, to hold every piece of the puzzle. Benjamin gathered the documents into neat stacks. I have one final matter. Everyone looked back toward him. The annual stewardship report also identified one governance concern requiring formal notification. My attention sharpened immediately. Governance concern Benjamin opened a thinner folder. Unlike the previous reports, this one contained no handwritten notes. Only correspondence, meeting minutes, trustee memoranda, and what looked like official banking records. He looked toward Harrison. This matter does not involve fraud. It does not involve theft. It does not allege criminal conduct. Harrison's shoulders relaxed slightly. Benjamin continued. It concerns repeated attempts to exercise authority beyond the limits granted by the trust. Every muscle in Harrison's face became still again. Benjamin lifted the first memorandum. The institutional trustee documented multiple occasions over the past 6 years during which proposed trust actions were presented as unilateral decisions. He turned another page. Oh, despite the governing documents requiring additional review. I watched Harrison carefully, not because I believed he had committed a crime, but because for the first time since I had known him, he looked like a man realizing that someone else had been quietly keeping records all along. Benjamin placed the memorandum gently on the table. There is no penalty associated with these findings. However, he rested one hand on the governance documents. Under Section 9 of the trust, future actions of the co-trustees will now require formal steward review before implementation. Then he looked directly at me. Mrs. Whitmore, beginning tonight, no major trust decision can become effective until it has first been provided to you for review. No one at the table seemed to remember there was still pie waiting to be served. The Thanksgiving dinner had quietly transformed into something none of us expected. Not a courtroom, not a family argument. Something stranger. A room where decades of assumptions were being replaced by documents. I looked at Benjamin. I need to make something clear. Every head turned toward me. I don't want control over anyone. Benjamin nodded. I didn't expect you would. I don't want to tell this family how to spend its money. You cannot. I don't want anyone's inheritance. You cannot alter that either. I exhaled slowly. Then why me? Benjamin's expression softened. I believe Mrs. Whitmore answered that question years ago. He reached into Brielle's file once more. Instead of another legal memorandum, he removed a cream-colored envelope. The paper looked older than everything else on the table. Its edges had begun to yellow with time. Across the front, written in elegant blue ink, were only 4 words. To my family. Benjamin looked toward Harrison. Your mother instructed that this letter be read only after the first family steward had been formally recognized. Harrison closed his eyes briefly. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a son about to hear his mother's voice again. Benjamin unfolded the letter. If you are hearing this, he paused, then the person sitting before you has earned something that cannot be purchased. The room became perfectly still. If that person is one of my children, Benjamin continued, I will be proud. If it is one of my grandchildren, I will also be proud. If it is someone who married into this family. Benjamin looked briefly toward me before returning to the page. Then I hope you remember that families become stronger when they welcome character instead of measuring blood. Margaret quietly wiped another tear. Benjamin kept reading. I spent my life watching successful people confuse ownership with responsibility. Owning something proves very little. Protecting it for people you'll never meet that is stewardship. I felt Mason's hand tighten gently around mine beneath the table. This time I held on. Benjamin continued. The greatest danger to any family fortune is not a dishonest stranger. It is the honest relative who slowly begins believing accountability no longer applies to them. The sentence lingered in the air. No one looked toward Harrison. No one needed to. Benjamin carefully folded the letter. That concludes Mrs. Whitmore's personal message. For nearly 30 seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Harrison broke the silence. So, his voice sounded noticeably different, less commanding. You review decisions now, I answered honestly, if the trust requires it. And if you disagree, I ask questions. Benjamin nodded. That is correct. I don't replace the trustees. No. I don't issue orders. No. I request documentation. Yes. I ensure the governing procedures have been followed. Exactly. I almost laughed. It sounded remarkably familiar. Not because it resembled power, because it resembled my normal workday. Review, questions, evidence, documentation, nothing more, nothing less. Claire leaned forward. So if Dad wants to sell one of Grandma's properties, Benjamin answered, he prepares the proposal. The trustees review it. Mrs. Whitmore receives the supporting documentation. If she determines the proposal complies with the trust, she acknowledges the review. And if she believes something is missing, she requests clarification. Claire frowned. So everything slows down. Benjamin smiled politely. Sometimes. But mistakes also become less likely. As someone who had worked in governance for years, I knew exactly why Evelyn had designed the system this way. Oversight wasn't meant to frustrate honest people. It was meant to protect them. Benjamin gathered several remaining papers. There is one final administrative matter. He slid a thin folder across the table toward me. I am required to provide you with these. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were orientation materials, nothing dramatic. Copies of the relevant trust sections, governance procedures, conflict of interest guidelines, confidentiality obligations, a checklist for reviewing future proposals. It looked less like an inheritance and more like accepting a volunteer position on the board of a nonprofit. I looked up. There's no compensation. Benjamin smiled. Mrs. Whitmore specifically prohibited compensation. Claire blinked. Seriously, Benjamin nodded. She believed stewardship should never become financially attractive. That sounded exactly like Evelyn. I could almost hear her saying it over tea. If people only do the right thing when paid, they haven't understood the assignment. For the first time that evening, a small smile found its way onto my face. Harrison noticed. He leaned back slowly. I suppose Mother thought of everything. Benjamin considered the statement. Almost. What does that mean? Benjamin closed his briefcase but didn't latch it. It means she also anticipated something else. Everyone looked toward him. The possibility that the first steward might decline the appointment. The room shifted again. I stared at him. I can refuse. Yes. The position is voluntary. Harrison looked at me immediately. Claire did too. Even Mason turned in his chair. Benjamin continued, if you decline, the role remains vacant until another individual satisfies the stewardship requirements in a future annual review. No one said anything, because everyone understood what was happening. For the first time all evening, the decision belonged entirely to me. Not Harrison, not Mason, not the trust officer, me. Benjamin placed a single signature page beside the orientation packet. This document does not appoint you. That has already occurred under the trust. It simply acknowledges whether you choose to accept the responsibilities. A fountain pen rested beside the paper. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I looked around the table. At Margaret, who suddenly looked hopeful. At Claire, who looked uncertain. At Mason, whose eyes carried both regret and quiet encouragement. Finally, at Harrison, the man who had called me just a guest less than an hour earlier. He didn't speak. He didn't tell me what to do. For the first time since I had known him, he simply waited. I lowered my eyes to the signature page. Just above the line where my name belonged, one sentence had been printed in bold. I accept this responsibility only if I can carry it with fairness, independence, and integrity. I read the sentence twice before I touched the pen. I accept this responsibility only if I can carry it with fairness, independence, and integrity. It wasn't a declaration of authority. It was a promise. I looked up at Benjamin. "If I sign this," he understood my question before I finished, "you are agreeing to perform the responsibilities described in the trust. And if I don't, the appointment remains inactive. The position stays vacant. Until someone else qualifies." "Correct." I rested the pen on the table. "I'd like a moment." "Of course." Benjamin stepped back without the slightest sign of impatience. No one else spoke either. For the first time since dinner began, the room wasn't waiting for Harrison. It was waiting for me. Ironically, that made me more uncomfortable than anything else that had happened that evening. I had spent my career trying to avoid becoming the center of attention. Good auditors rarely were. Our work was supposed to strengthen systems, not elevate ourselves. I turned toward Mason. "Can we talk?" He nodded immediately. We stepped into the library just off the dining room, leaving the door slightly open. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Mason broke the silence. "I don't know how to apologize for tonight." I looked at him carefully. "Don't apologize for your father's words." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "Apologize for yours." He frowned. "I barely said anything." "Exactly." The words came out more gently than I expected. "When your father called me just a guest, the most painful part wasn't hearing him say it. It was realizing you still believed staying quiet would protect everyone." Mason lowered his eyes. "I thought if I challenged him in front of the family, it would only make things worse. It made things worse anyway." "I know. I've known for a long time." His voice cracked ever so slightly. "I just never admitted it." I leaned against one of Evelyn's old bookcases. "Do you know how many times I've heard you say, 'That's just how Dad is'?" He gave a tired smile. "Too many. Every time you said it, I started wondering whether I was asking for something unreasonable." "You weren't." "I wasn't asking you to choose me over your father." I paused. "I was asking you to stand beside me." Mason covered his face with one hand. "I failed." There was no argument left to make, because he was right, not maliciously, not intentionally, but he had failed. "I've been thinking about Grandma all evening," he said quietly. "The questions she used to ask." I smiled faintly. "What do you do when nobody is watching?" He nodded. "I thought she was talking about business ethics." "So did I." "I think she was talking about courage." His words surprised me. Maybe because they were true. Courage wasn't only standing up to strangers. Sometimes it meant standing up to people you loved. Mason took a slow breath. "I spent most of my life believing keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting my family." "It isn't." "No. It just protects the person creating the conflict." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "I was going to wait until tomorrow." He unfolded a single sheet of paper. "I don't think I should." I took it from him. It wasn't part of the trust. It was a letter, addressed to Harrison Whitmore. "I wrote this yesterday." "You expected tonight to go badly?" I didn't know how, but I knew something had changed. I glanced at the first paragraph. "Dad. For years, I've confused respect with obedience. They're not the same thing." I looked back at Mason. "You were going to give him this." "Yes. I've rewritten it 3 times. What changed?" "I finally realized the problem isn't that you're my wife. The problem is that I've expected you to tolerate things I would never accept if someone treated our future children that way." The sentence stayed with me. Future children. We had talked about starting a family, then stopped talking about it. Neither of us ever admitted why. Deep down, I think we both knew. Neither of us wanted to bring a child into a family where disrespect had become normal. Mason looked at the floor. I don't want our son growing up believing silence is strength. I don't want our daughter believing love requires enduring humiliation. I folded the letter carefully. Those are the first words you've said tonight that make me believe things can actually change. He nodded. I've already called a counselor. I blinked. You what? Yesterday? I made an appointment. I hoped we'd go. I wasn't sure you'd say yes. He smiled sadly. So I made it anyway. For the first time that evening, I saw something different. Not guilt. Responsibility. There was a difference. Guilt focused on the past. Responsibility changed the future. I'll go, I said. His shoulders dropped with visible relief. But I need you to understand something. Anything. If we rebuild this marriage, it won't happen because tonight embarrassed your father. It won't happen because the trust recognized me. It will happen because your actions become different from this point forward. He nodded immediately. I understand. No, I held his eyes. I need you to prove you understand. I will. I believed he meant it, whether he could live it. That would take time. We returned to the dining room together. Everyone was exactly where we had left them. Benjamin stood quietly near the fireplace. Margaret was speaking softly with one of the cousins. Claire sat alone, staring into an untouched cup of coffee. Harrison remained at the head of the table, still, silent. When Mason walked back into the room, he didn't return to his original seat. Instead, he pulled out the chair beside mine. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, except that every Thanksgiving before this one, he had quietly accepted wherever his father placed him. Tonight he moved without asking permission. Harrison noticed immediately. So we're changing the seating arrangement now, Mason answered calmly. No. I'm choosing where my wife and I sit. There was no anger in his voice, no challenge, just certainty. Harrison looked at his son for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't approve. He simply accepted it. That was the first real change I'd ever seen in him. Benjamin picked up the acknowledgement form again. Mrs. Whitmore. I looked at the signature line, then at Evelyn's letter, then at Mason. Finally, I spoke. I'll accept the responsibility. A few relatives let out quiet breaths. But I looked directly at Benjamin. I have one condition. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. The trust doesn't require you to accept conditions. I know. My condition isn't for the trust. It's for myself. He waited. I will never use this role to settle personal scores. I won't review decisions because someone hurt my feelings. I'll only ask the same questions I ask every day at work. Is it documented? Is it transparent? Does it follow the governing rules? Benjamin smiled for the first time all evening. I believe Mrs. Whitmore would have been very pleased with that answer. I signed my name, Brielle Powell Whitmore. Benjamin countersigned beneath it as witness. He closed the folder. Congratulations. I shook my head gently. This doesn't feel like something to celebrate. No, he agreed. It feels like something to protect. As Benjamin secured the documents inside his briefcase, Harrison finally stood. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I wasn't sure which surprised me more, the words themselves, or the fact that they came without anyone asking for them. Harrison remained standing. The room waited. For decades, people had waited for Harrison Whitmore to speak because he controlled the conversation. This time was different. No one was waiting because of his authority. They were waiting because an apology means very little until the person hearing it decides whether it matters. He looked at me for several long seconds. I owe you an apology. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I called you a guest. I reduced everything you've done for this family to a single sentence. I was wrong. No one interrupted him, not even Benjamin. Harrison slowly placed both hands on the back of his chair. I've spent most of my life believing that protecting my family's legacy meant protecting our bloodline. He gave a faint, tired smile. My mother apparently spent most of her life trying to teach me the opposite. Margaret looked at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't resentment. It was sadness. The kind that comes from realizing someone could have learned an important lesson years earlier. I answered honestly. I appreciate the apology. Harrison nodded. But, I continued before he could mistake my gratitude for complete forgiveness. An apology doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't. I accept that you regret what you said. I do. But trust doesn't return because someone finally says the right words. He lowered his eyes. I understand. I hope you do. For the first time since I had known him, Harrison didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He didn't blame stress. He didn't mention tradition. He simply accepted the truth. Benjamin quietly closed his briefcase. I believe my responsibilities here are complete. He looked around the room. Before I leave, there is one final instruction from Mrs. Whitmore. He reached into the outside pocket of the briefcase and removed a small envelope. This isn't part of the trust. It's personal. He handed it directly to me. The family requested that I deliver this only after the acknowledgement was signed. I turned the envelope over. The handwriting was unmistakable. Evelyn Whitmore. Inside was a folded note no longer than a single page. Benjamin stepped back. I'll give you privacy. I unfolded the letter carefully. The room remained silent as I began reading aloud. My dear Brielle, if this letter has reached you then, my faith in people has been rewarded. You may be wondering why I chose someone who wasn't born a Whitmore. The answer is simple. Names are inherited. Character is earned. You never treated this family as an opportunity. You treated it as a responsibility. That is why I trusted you. Please remember something important. The purpose of this role is never to win arguments. It is to protect fairness. If one day you find yourself enjoying the authority more than the responsibility, walk away from it. And if my family finally learns that love without accountability becomes control, then this trust has served its greatest purpose. With affection, Evelyn. When I finished reading, no one spoke. The silence felt peaceful this time. Not heavy, not uncertain. Peaceful. Benjamin gave me a respectful nod. Mrs. Whitmore. It has been an honor. He shook Mason's hand, then Harrison's. Finally, he walked quietly toward the front door. The evening that had begun with humiliation ended with the trust officer disappearing into the cold Connecticut night as quietly as he had arrived. The following weeks were far less dramatic than anyone might imagine. There were no shouting matches, no lawsuits, no attempts to overturn Evelyn's wishes. After meeting with the family's attorneys, Harrison learned exactly what Benjamin had explained. The trust had been drafted correctly. Every procedure had been followed. Every annual review had been documented. Every instruction had been carried out exactly as Evelyn intended. There was nothing to challenge. More importantly, there was nothing to hide anymore. Mason and I began attending marriage counseling the following month. Not because our marriage had failed, because we wanted to make sure it wouldn't. Those sessions were uncomfortable, sometimes painful, often humbling. Mason learned that avoiding conflict had never actually protected anyone. I learned that carrying every disappointment in silence wasn't strength either. Healthy boundaries required both people to participate. Over the next year, Harrison changed in small ways. Not overnight, Not perfectly. Sometimes he still caught himself speaking as though his opinion ended every discussion. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he forgot. Real change looked less impressive than people imagine. It looked like repeated choices. One conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one act of humility at a time. The following Thanksgiving arrived almost exactly 1 year later. This time, Mason and I arrived early. The dining room looked familiar. The same walnut table, the same crystal chandeliers, the same white roses. Only one thing had changed. There were no assigned seats. I noticed immediately. So, I smiled at Margaret. No seating cards this year. She laughed. Harrison had them printed. What happened? She looked toward the kitchen. He threw them away. A moment later, Harrison walked into the dining room carrying a tray of coffee. He caught me looking at the empty places around the table. I thought people should sit where they wanted. He hesitated. It seemed more appropriate. I smiled. I think Evelyn would have liked that. He smiled back. I've been thinking the same thing. No one mentioned the trust during dinner. No one needed to. Its greatest success wasn't changing who inherited the family's wealth. It was changing how the family understood responsibility. As we prepared to leave that evening, Harrison stopped me near the front door. Brielle. Yes. I called you a guest last Thanksgiving. You did. He nodded once. I won't make that mistake again. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I appreciate that. Then I gently placed my hand on the doorknob. But I also need you to understand something. He waited. I didn't become family because the trust recognized me. I became family because I chose to act like one long before anyone else noticed. He smiled quietly. I know. As Mason and I drove home through the snow, I looked out the window and realized something I hadn't understood a year earlier. Justice hadn't come from embarrassing Harrison. Healing hadn't come from winning an argument. Both had come from something much simpler. Evidence had revealed the truth. Boundaries had protected my peace, and once I stopped trying to earn a place at someone else's table, I discovered I had always known exactly where I belonged. Some wounds don't come from strangers. They come from the people whose acceptance we spend years trying to earn. That can make us question our worth, our voice, and even our place in the world. But the truth is, your value has never depended on whether someone chooses to acknowledge it. Respect built on fear, money, or family titles is fragile. Respect built on integrity, consistency, and quiet character lasts far longer than any inheritance ever could. One of the hardest lessons in life is learning that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. You can let go of bitterness without reopening the door to unhealthy behavior. Boundaries are not punishment. They are a way of protecting the peace you've worked so hard to build. Sometimes justice isn't watching someone lose everything. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to lose yourself anymore. If you've ever been treated like an outsider in your own family, I hope this story reminds you that your character is something no one can take away. Keep choosing honesty over manipulation, patience over revenge, and evidence over anger. The people who truly matter will eventually recognize the difference. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set healthy boundaries with someone you loved? How did it change your life? Share your experience in the comments. Your story may encourage someone who needs it today. And if stories about resilience, family justice, and healing speak to you, please subscribe and join us for the next journey. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.